Go ahead.
Excellent. Welcome to this Garden presentation. Today we're going to be talking about the serverless framework. In particular, we're kind of dive a little bit more into the concepts of infrastructure as code and how we can use that to simplify the deployment of services and making our lives easier in that regard. So, continuing onward, just a quick kind of definitions for those who are unaware. Serverless is, in some form or another, infrastructure as code. For those who are not aware, infrastructure as code is the management of infrastructure in a descriptive model using the same version as DevOps to keep track of source code. So the best way that people can kind of use infrastructure as code and see how this works is if you're familiar with AWS's CloudFormation, it allows you to provision and create different resources and roles through pretty much just like JSON and YAML files. So it allows you to provision all those things through files and text and key value properties. To dive a little bit more, to dive deeper into this, serverless in particular implements something called continuous configuration automation, which is in essence an extension of traditional infrastructure as code frameworks. What you do is you leverage a lot of those infrastructure as code frameworks to change, configure, and automate infrastructure. The leverage that it has over, or the leg up it has over traditional infrastructure as code frameworks is that it just simplifies the process and allows for greater flexibility in the provisioning and deploying of those resources. So getting technical, other CCA frameworks are Terraform and Ansible, along with serverless. Serverless is actually a CCA framework. So that's kind of a little bit of background of the kind of the principles why serverless is important for the provisioning automatically of resources. Here's kind of a quick overview of serverless's installation. Serverless is nice in that you can install it from an npm package. It also you can download and install the binaries if you didn't want to mess with npm, but npm makes it nice and easy. And then running the initial setup to create a project with serverless is nice. They kind of give you a nice leg up to start a project without having to modify existing code. So I actually want to jump into kind of some demo with that to illustrate just the ease that serverless brings in deploying infrastructure. So for this Garden presentation, I'm going to be focusing within the AWS landscape, mostly because that's what we use as a company and that's what I'm most comfortable with. But you could also use serverless for Google Cloud as well as Azure and pretty much any other cloud technology or platform that is out there. So as we begin, let's just jump on and follow along kind of with this demo and illustrate some of the key aspects and important parts of the serverless framework. Let's actually make this a little bit bigger just for viewing purposes. So as we can see, you can actually create a project by just running serverless. And this is, I've already installed serverless on my computer, so this is kind of, no-brainer. And this is just Node freaking out about my version. So now we can jump in and just run the serverless command. So as we can see, serverless detected that there was no projects in the directory. So we just want to create a new one. Just indicate yes. We're going to be working specifically with Node for this demo. However, serverless does support Python, Java, Ruby, and most of the frameworks and languages that AWS itself supports. So let's just dive in. We want to create a project for Node, and then we just want to name our project something easy to remember. So we'll just do Garden. There we go. So we successfully created a serverless project, and then serverless also has a bunch of online tools for monitoring and other important health checks for your services. We don't want to do that. A lot of their features require to actually pay, so we're just going to operate within the open source free portion of their code. So now that we've created that project, let's actually open that up so we can take a look further at the properties of a serverless project. So here we go. Let's jump on in. So first thing, since serverless is really built for, like its name indicates, serverless applications, so it integrates really well with AWS's Lambda and API Gateway for functionality. So the sample demo-based project that serverless creates is for a Lambda. Here we can see that we have our handler that's being exported, and all this Lambda code will return a status code. It'll stringify and send back exactly what we sent it in the event body. So let's jump in actually to the serverless portion of this project. This is where things get interesting and we start kind of seeing how you can provision resources. So first things first, we've got like a service name. This is really just the name of your project and is used when serverless is deploying your code, because what serverless will do, it will actually translate this YAML file, which could also be JSON, but YAML is just the default. It'll translate this YAML file into AWS CloudFormation templates and run off of that. So this will be the name of your AWS CloudFormation project with any other postfix names. This is the framework version, just for versioning purposes. And here's where we start to provision resources. We're indicating to serverless that we actually are going to be using AWS resources. The global runtime for any of our Lambdas or functions we're deploying is going to be Node.js, and then there's just a Lambda hashing version. And then finally, the last piece, the last required piece is just to specify the functions and the handler. So we tell it that we're actually going to be deploying functions. The name of that function is going to be hello. And this identifier is just used because you can fit multiple functions within this project and deploy them. So you could do, for example, we could just do hello2 and have another handler for another Lambda that we're trying to deploy. So that just helps identify those. And then we just specify the handler entry point, which we can see as .hello from the handler file. So there's the most basic serverless project that you can create. And let's actually run it, and we can see how it looks when we're deploying, and we can jump into AWS and see that everything's working correctly. So deploying with serverless is simple. We can just do serverless deploy, and it'll take off for, once again, we're going to have another npm issue. And now we can jump in and deploy it. So as we can see, it's packaging up the service. It can exclude dependencies, and it's going to create the AWS CloudFormation stack. So that's in progress. So something interesting to kind of note about serverless in particular is that it's really built and geared to make your life easier on this aspect when it comes to deploying Lambdas and AWS resources for serverless functionality. If you're wanting to go more in depth with like AWS EC2 instances and stuff like that, there are other infrastructure as code frameworks that work better, like Terraform. So this kind of fits a narrow specification, makes it a lot easier. And here we run into our first error. I actually forgot to specify that we were going to deploy this on my personal AWS account, since I don't have permission to create roles on the company account. So we can actually just give it the flag to specify the AWS profile. And if we specify it as personal, I misspelled that. I can't spell personal. There we go. So now to use my credentials to deploy to my AWS account. Delete failed. Oh, we had a failure of a deletion of a previous line garden. Let me quickly just delete that. So we actually wanted to delete the S3 bucket as well. So let's quickly wait for that to delete. Okay, sorry about that. Now we can deploy it because there won't be a project in CloudFormation with the same name. So there's just another example of how serverless takes care of a lot of that error checking and making sure things don't conflict or cause issues. There's a lot of checking on the back end to make sure you're actually doing the right thing, and it'll usually scream at you before you do something wrong or that would cause issues. Alright, as you can see, it finished creating the CloudFormation. It's uploading those artifacts. It's updating the CloudFormation with the new information. And there we go. All right, so it just finished deploying everything to AWS. So let's jump in. As you can see quickly, it'll just give you a little information about the service we just deployed, service name. It'll give us the stage, which is just the default since we didn't specify anything further. It tells us the region it was deployed to, which is also the serverless default. There's the name of the stack in CloudFormation, and then it'll tell us the functions that were deployed and the name of those functions. So let's jump into AWS, and if we refresh the console page so we see the update information, here is the CloudFormation stack that was created and deployed. As you can see, it has a status of update complete. Anytime you deploy, you can get different statuses. For example, update complete, you can have something fail and it'll try and roll back those changes. Specifies all the events so you can follow along and see what happened, like we created the bucket for it, we created the execution role, created the Lambda function, the log groups, and all of that. So this is a great source to come to when your deployment fails. Now, just to further verify that things worked, let's jump in and show the Lambda function, which there we go, minegarden-dev-hello. And it was created 2 minutes ago. So we can see that is properly working. And then let's just quickly show a test of this working. We can just send it, yeah, that works perfectly. We'll just send it any JSON body because we expect just to get back what we give it. If we click test, there we go. We can see that we had a response code of 200 and the function executed successfully. So there is a Lambda deployed with serverless. As you can tell, it doesn't take a lot of code a lot of serverless code to get up and running. So now I want to dive into a more complicated example to kind of show the scope of what's possible with serverless. And in particular, I want to use the example that kind of got me going with serverless and helped me dive in and learn it more, which was the pre-renderer, actually. We wanted to transition this to serverless so that we had better and greater flexibility over deployments and rolling back. So let's actually open up that project, and we can look a little bit more at the serverless code for that. I need to leave that directory. And then we want to go to Alright. So here's where we get to dive in and see kind of the greater extent of the flexibility and things that are provided by serverless. So it'll still have some of the same basic structures, but with a lot of differences. Actually, let's just jump through these slides here. Yeah, and here's a list of important terms that we'll dive into a little bit more as we go through. We talked about the service, how it's the name of our project. The package, we'll dive into that, which allows you to include and exclude different deployment files. The provider specifies the service we're deploying to. Functions allow us to specify one or more lambdas or other things to deploy. And the resources are additional things necessary. So now we can jump back into this, just making sure we weren't missing anything, and jumping at the top. So for the pre-render, we have our service with the name of pre-renderer. And that's very standard like we saw last time. Now package, like we saw quickly on the slide, allows us to specify what we want to include in our build, exclude, or specify a build artifact. So in this case with the pre-renderer, I'm specifying a build file that we created build.zip, which contains all the necessary code for deploying the pre-renderer. And then if we jump down here with provider, we're once again going to use AWS because this is a Lambda we're deploying. And since we were transitioning the pre-renderer to a serverless framework, a serverless deployment model, we had a lot of pre-existing resources in AWS that we didn't want to have to delete and recreate because a lot of other services were dependent on those. So, for example, with AWS, with serverless, we were able to specify the role that we wanted this Lambda to use when operating. So we pre-specified the pre-render role, which already existed, specified the runtime, gave it the memory size for the Lambda, the timeout time, specified the region, and specified the stage. Now, something important to note, anything within this provider group will apply globally to any functions. So, for example, this memory size applies to this pre-render function down here. Same with the timeout. If you wanted to specify something on a function level, you would go in and specify that property as well here. So you could do memory size and give it 1024, for example, to specify that's the memory size that you want that specific function to have. Same with the timeouts and all of that. Now, something important to note before we move further is you can actually use environment variables in serverless in order to add a little bit more flexibility to your deployments. For example, we wanted to be able to specify with just a simple change whether we were deploying staging, production, dev, or any other stage you could think of without having to go in and alter this file. So we can specify that we want to use the stage environment variable to specify what stage we're actually deploying to. So that can be used with a lot of flexibility. So if we jump down into the functions, you can see we're specifying a pre-render function. We're giving it the handler, which is within the build file, index JS file with the handler method name. We specify the name of the function also using an environment variable. So this is a very flexible script. We can specify everything through the command line. And then we also give it a layer. So this is kind of showing just the great flexibility that serverless has in being able to pull other resources that you would have to provision by hand into it. We have a Chrome layer so that we aren't uploading an npm or a node modules package that is larger than the file limits that Lambda accepts. Since this particular functionality is over 100 megabytes, that wouldn't fit within the Lambda size. So we have a pre-existing layer that we want to actually connect this Lambda to, and you can specify that within the layers, just giving it its ARN value, which is great because it allows you to also, anything you can customize within the AWS web console or through their CLI, you can specify with serverless. So we kind of looked at that already. Here's some new content, which is the resources section, which allows us to actually specify further permissions. For example, we want the dev and the staging Rails API to be able to hit the pre-renderer, but we don't the staging pre-renderer, but we don't want them to be able to hit the production pre-renderer. So we specify different permissions, Lambda permissions, as we can see, for different use cases. For example, we also had an API gateway that was already built that was connecting into the pre-renderer, and we wanted to be able to make sure it could still do so with our switch to serverless. So we re-specified those source ARN values and then gave it the principal where it came from and all of that. You can actually get most of this information directly from the AWS console, web console. If you, for example, for Lambda, if you go into the resources section, it'll have a JSON file of the resource information, and all this information can be found in there. So it's really easy to migrate existing services to serverless and keep their resources, roles, and permissions the same. So, great thing about resources is you can conditionally choose which ones to attach to a resource. Conditionally choose which resource you want to attach to, like a Lambda or a different AWS functionality by specifying conditions. This one, for example, detects what the stage is of the Lambda we're deploying. If it's equal to staging, this will be set to true, and it'll deploy anything that has that for a condition. So, for example, deploying only these ones for staging, we have our condition, and it checks is staging. So if the stages match, it'll actually say, okay, we're good to deploy and attach this resource. So that allows for flexibility where you can give certain services different resources and permissions based on what stage they're in and other specifications. So that's kind of an overview as well of the resources section. It's fairly straightforward, but it's more technical because you kind of have to dive into the existing resources that you have and seeing what their policies are, as well as diving a little bit into the serverless documentation to make sure you're specifying them correctly. And then finally, another great thing about serverless is you can actually extend the functionality past what is there with add-ons. So within a little custom section, you can add other functionalities. For example, we have a prune one, which this module does is make sure that within Lambda, we only keep the 15 latest versions of what we've deployed. And we have it set to automatically do this whenever we deploy. And this is just so that we don't ever exceed our limit of versions that we can have. We don't foresee really ever hitting this, but it's a great little script to have and kind of demonstrates that functionality within serverless. So this is kind of a high-level view of serverless and the functionality it has. There's a lot of technical detail you can dive into in the documentation, and you can also you can really do a lot with it. Just kind of in conclusion, we went through some of these key terms. We talked about the pre-renderer, and just as a conclusion, we wanted to be able to deploy and update and roll back the pre-render Lambda, which is why serverless was our first option. We wanted to also maintain different stages with the same code, but we didn't want to have to fiddle with deploying and managing different resources and services manually. And so it allows you to deploy as many stages as possible without any issues. And so we talked about that. Just kind of in conclusion, to wrap this all up, any project that uses that can use an infrastructure as code framework should do it for the sake of making developers' lives easier. That way, that knowledge is not dependent on a specific person knowing where everything resides. It can all be laid out explicitly. Plus, DevOps is becoming a bigger part of every developer's job as we move to microservices and other you could say, using the cloud honestly as our main deployment and service landing place. Messing up words there, but it's really important that people have an understanding of the importance of infrastructure as code, and I hope that this presentation on serverless kind of got your feet wet to let you see what's possible, as well as show that the most basic projects are easy to get started on and get going. So
I know that, thanks for that. And by the way, we did it before. There was a rousing applause. I'm not going to do that now, but I just want to record that for the recording. But also, there was discussion about the development environment, right? And being able to, if there are tools inside serverless to help us with the local dev, or does it actually deploy out to something out there? And I believe we looked that up and we found some answers to that, right?
Yes, I think specifically Matt mentioned that there are some frameworks, like where we showed on serverless, the little custom section. There are actually some modules you can use that allow you to spin up a local instance of what your Lambda would be, or API gateway, which allows you to test locally without having to actually deploy to AWS or Azure or any other place.
Yeah, and in particular, we're actually using one in our Docker container right now called Local Stack.
Local Stack, yeah.
And he was saying that there was actually a plugin for that.
Yeah, that lets those two connect and work together. So very
Cool.
flexible in how it comes together.
Very nice. That's I think that's it.
Awesome.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.